Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Upstream Strategies, Inc. We are an organization dedicated to helping parents and families discover, find, and employ educational opportunities for their children. We are particularly focused on any and all research that puts the child at the center of the educational process and makes decisions on what is best for them, and supporting the parents in regards to this outcome. We have a special guest today. It is Corey DeAngelis, National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children, Executive Director at Educational Freedom Institute, Senior Fellow at Reason Foundation, and Adjunct Fellow at the K12 Institute. Let's welcome him to our podcast today. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great. You are one popular person. Man, you've been on Fox News. You've been doing interviews. You've got research being published in national media outlets. Wow, you've got quite the resume.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I really got into this with research. I did my PhD at the University of Arkansas, where I mostly studied school choice programs. My first study being the effects of the Milwaukee private school choice program on crime reduction, which was, I would say, really interesting because a lot of people haven't really looked into these non-test score type of outcomes, these character development effects of school choice. And more recently, I think I've been changing the conversation from school choice towards the idea of funding students as opposed to systems. And I think that's been very helpful in the national debate because school choice might not mean a lot to a lot of people if they don't really understand what the policy looks like. But when you talk about funding students directly, it's pretty transparent. It's the idea that the education funding should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education, whether that's the public school or a private school or another type of homeschooling setup.
Yeah, so it's really child-centered, which aligns with the goal and mission of our organization, our foundation as well. So I've got a question for you that I know you could really speak to in your expertise, and that is all research seems to point to parental involvement as the top variable in good educational outcomes. So where do you see the lack of school choice? I term it as a government monopoly on education, where it undermines parents, it alienates them, it disengages them in the decision-making process and oversight of their children's education.
Yeah, so I would argue school choice improves the amount of parental involvement in education. And we actually do have a study on this. You don't really need a study to realize that, well, when you give families more power in their kids' education, well, one, by definition, they're going to be more involved with their child's education, but then they'll also have a stronger incentive to seek out information about their kids' education provider if they know that they have the means to make that choice. So school choice can empower parents to do so. There's actually a study, I think it was published in 2017 by a couple of Cornell researchers, and they found that when school choice programs were implemented in a location, well, the search activity online for private education options skyrocketed, and that doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out, but it's interesting that we do have some data on that type of outcome, parental involvement in education. But as we've seen for decades, and in particular over the past couple of years, the teachers' unions have fought as hard as possible against any change to the status quo. You correctly refer to the status quo education system as a monopoly. If you want another option for your kid, if your residentially assigned government-run school doesn't work, there's high transaction costs associated with getting a better product. You have to, one, you can pay out of pocket to cover private school tuition and fees. You're essentially paying twice, once through the tax system, and then again for a school you're not using, and then again out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. That's totally ridiculous. Or you can pay to change houses, which is a total pain in the butt, even if you had the money to do so. Just imagine if your restaurant that is nearby your house just stopped working for you for whatever reason. Maybe they just got a new chef and it didn't work out, and you wanted to shop at another restaurant or even another grocery store, and you had to move houses in order to exercise a different choice. That wouldn't make any sense. It would mean that the grocery store and restaurant that you're assigned to would have zero incentive to do a good job. And we see that same problem with the traditional school system all across the country right now. We saw it more than ever when the public schools, starting in 2020, were fighting to keep their doors closed, whereas the private schools in most places were fighting to keep their doors open. And the difference there was one of incentives, that one of those sectors receives children's education dollars regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. And in fact, it was even worse than that. They were able to lobby to the government, hold children's education hostage in order to secure multiple multi-billion-dollar ransom payments from the federal government. So the incentives are completely upside down in the traditional system. The only way that we'll ever fix that is to attach the money to the child and to let the families decide, public or private school, whatever's best for their kid. That would provide true bottom-up accountability for all schools to do the right thing for kids.
So just clarification and make sure I'm getting this right, and you can speak into it, is that basically when the school system shut down due to COVID, they not only received the funds from property taxes and the existing tax structure, they also got windfalls of money from COVID relief from the federal government. And yet all of that money from the tax base locally in property taxes and all that money from the federal government, it didn't go to the students at all because the students were still locked out of their schools. So it went somewhere. Where did it go?
It went to the closed school buildings, and the teachers unions loved that because they understood that they could keep their benefits the same in terms of job security and pay while reducing their costs associated with commuting to work, with having to provide in-person services, and any other costs associated with going back into the buildings. And look, I want to be clear. I don't blame the employees in the traditional system for having a good setup where they're in a system that provides them with the same amount of benefits regardless of whether they return to work. I don't, you can't really blame the people in the system. It's the problem with the system itself.
Yes.
And I think this kind of turned a light bulb on in the heads of so many parents over the past couple of years. If their grocery store, for whatever reason, decided not to reopen, well, at least they could take their funding for groceries elsewhere. If their neighborhood Safeway or Walmart didn't reopen for whatever reason, they could say, okay, I'm going to take this money to Trader Joe's or to another Walmart or to another Safeway. The funding would follow the decision of the family. And that's true even if we're talking about taxpayer funded initiatives. We have food stamps, for example. The food stamp funding doesn't go straight to $1 billion regardless of how well it does or regardless of the choice of the family, or regardless of whether it opens. The funding goes to the family, and they could choose Walmart, Safeway, Trader Joe's, or any other provider. Mm-hmm. And we do the same thing with higher education with Pell Grants. Pell Grant funding goes to the student. You can pick the public or community college if you want, but you could also go to a private, religious, or non-religious university. We do the same thing with pre-K programs. See, we have the federal Head Start program, for example. The money doesn't go straight to a residentially assigned government-run provider of pre-K. Instead, it goes to the family, and they could choose private, religious, or non-religious providers of pre-K services. And all I'm arguing with school choice, and most other advocates would similarly argue, that we apply that same concept to the in-between years of K-12 education to fund the people as opposed to the buildings.
So it's kind of like doing what we're already doing.
Sure. Right. And you can apply this concept in every industry. You can think about Medicaid dollars. We don't tell families using Medicaid that they must spend the money at a particular government-run hospital. You could take the Medicaid dollars to a religiously affiliated private hospital if you want. We do the same thing with Section 8 housing vouchers. You don't have to use it for government housing. You can take the funding to any provider of housing of your choosing that's privately provided, obviously. And I'm not arguing that anything about whether any of these other programs are good or bad. All I'm arguing is that if we're going to spend the money, it might as well go to people as opposed to the buildings, just like we do with all these other things. And what's interesting is, like, a lot of the same people who support all of these other initiatives that fund people as opposed to buildings with higher education, pre-K, and everything else, they get all up in arms about it only when it comes to K-12 education. And that raises an important question. Why would that be? Why would you support all of these other things, but not funding people directly when it comes to K-12 education? Well, the answer is pretty obvious for you and I, is that there's a difference in power dynamics, that choice is the norm for everything else, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest only when it comes to K-12 education. And so, of course, they fight as hard as possible against any change to the status quo, and they fight against parental rights in education every step of the way. But it doesn't mean that it should be that way. And, they only have one argument that they put forward every single time. Well, one thing they'll say is public money for public schools. And it's like, well, there's no such thing as public money. First of all, it's taxpayer money that is taken from private hands. But secondly, we have public taxpayer funding going to private institutions for all of these other things that you support. Why are you only talking about public this, public that when it comes to K-12 education? Well, it's because it never had anything to do with logic. It's always had a lot to do with power dynamics. And they'll argue that this is stealing money from the public schools. But the money doesn't belong to the buildings. It doesn't belong to the public or private schools. The money is meant for educating the child, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, whether it's public or private. No one would say that allowing families to choose where their food stamp dollars go steals money from Walmart. That would be absolutely ridiculous for anyone to say that, because we all understand that funding, and for every other program, belongs to the families, or at least it's meant for the families, and they should have a choice in the matter. Let's do the same thing for K-12 education. And one more response to this ridiculous argument is, first of all, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the kids and the families. Second is, well, why would that happen? It's more of a rhetorical question. Why would giving families a choice defund the public schools if they're doing a good job? Well, the reality is the people repeating this argument don't have confidence in their product. They're essentially admitting that they understand that thousands, if not millions, of families would choose something else when given the option. That's an argument for school choice, not against it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting you said earlier is that people who are in the system, you don't blame them. My wife was an educator. She was a high school math teacher. My daughter-in-law is an educator in the local high school. All my children went to public schools. My last child is still in public school. We know a ton of teachers and administrators who are top-notch people, but it seems they are frustrated. They are underpaid. They are overwhelmed with the workload and the bureaucracy. How would school choice help these people that are in the system so that we can give them a vision for wanting change?
Yeah, so competition in the market for goods and services is obviously good for families, students, and customers, but competition in the labor market is similarly good for employees. In the current K-12 education system, there's essentially something called a monopsony in the labor market. You have one big employer, which is the government. And if you want to go into K-12 education to teach, you don't have a lot of private sector employers to choose from. And so teachers don't have a lot of choice in the current system. If you fund students directly and you advance school choice, families will have more of a choice, which will give their employers stronger incentives to listen to them, whether it comes in terms of higher salaries or more autonomy. And we see that often in the private sector, where teachers don't have to deal with as much of the red tape and bureaucracy that you see in the government-run school system. And there's also another way in which this helps teachers in the public and private schools, is that the current government-run school system is a monopoly that doesn't have strong incentives to put the resources towards the most important educational resource in the school, which happens to be the teacher. And so what we see over time is more and more of the funding being thrown at the failing system, but not making its way into the classroom. It goes towards administrative bloat and just putting more people into the buildings, which means less money for individual teachers who are already doing a good job in the system. For example, Kennesaw State University professor Ben Scafferty, he's an economist over there, looked at the data nationwide between 1992 and 2014, and he pointed out that nationwide per pupil education expenditures in the government-run school system actually increased by 27% after adjusting for inflation, but teacher salaries over the same period actually dropped in real terms by 2%. So we're putting more money into the system. Teachers are complaining pretty often about how they had to dig into their pockets to pay for supplies each and every year. And I actually feel kind of bad for them. But the problem isn't with their competition in terms of private and charter schools. The problem is that their employer doesn't have the right incentives to do the right thing with the additional funding. The teachers union bosses, which are not the same thing as teachers union members on the ground, have an incentive just to put more people into the buildings. I'm thinking of Randy Weingarten, for example, from the American Federation of Teachers, who makes over $560,000 a year. Their incentive is to put more people into the buildings because that means more dues paying members and a larger voting bloc. But that means less money left over to go towards the individual teacher salaries. And then again, the red tape is a huge problem. And there's actually 5 studies that exist on the topic that I've outlined at the Washington Examiner in a post called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. All 5 of these studies that I've found on the topic find that private and charter school competition leads to higher teacher salaries in the public schools too. And again, that's because it gives their employers an incentive to put that money towards the important educational resource, the teacher, because they have an incentive to listen to the customers who are the families. And the families are going to choose schools that are doing a good job. What better way to allocate the resources than towards the classroom and the teachers?
Yeah.
So it's a win-win situation. It benefits teachers, families. It just doesn't benefit the teachers union bosses like Randy Weingarten and the superintendents.
Yeah, and I hope that teachers who are listening to this, I know we have a lot of teachers that listen to various podcasts that I do and share it with other teachers and administrators, is that they really start to think is that the issue isn't necessarily the teacher. What it is it's the bureaucracy of a monopoly, because I've spoken with my audience on numerous occasions, is that there's a philosophy of bureaucracy. And people are not aware of that. And there's certain systems that just by their very nature, their entire incentive structure is not to do what's best for, in this particular case, children and what educates children. So the mission, it's not mission creep, it's antithetical to the mission of educating children.
Yeah, and what's really crazy about all of this is that the bureaucracy actually gets to keep a lot of the money, and this usually gets lost in the conversation about school choice because they throw their hands up in the air, and the bureaucracy likes to say, "Oh, this is going to just defund and destroy our schools." I've already responded to that in a couple of ways. You know, that's not your money in the first place. 2, why would that happen if you're doing a good job? You're admitting that you're a failure. That's not the argument you want to make. But then 3, and most people don't realize this, is that the government-run schools nationwide spend about $15,000, $16,000 per student, according to the 2019 Census Bureau numbers. It's probably a lot higher now because of the bailouts that started in March of 2020 for supposed COVID relief, when a lot of the money hasn't even been spent yet, and a lot of it wasn't even used for reopening schools safely. In fact, in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate, there was an amendment that was put forward to try to make that funding based on actually reopening the schools. Like, let's make it contingent upon actually reopening the schools if it's about COVID relief and safely reopening schools. That amendment actually failed on a 50-50 partisan vote. And so the money didn't even have to be spent. It didn't have to be, the schools didn't have to open in order for them to receive the COVID relief money. But the third part, the third response I want to say to this, you're destroying our schools and you're taking our funding, is that these programs typically tend to be only about half of the total funding following the child. It's usually the state portion of the funding following the child, which on average is nationwide about half. So let's say 7,000 or 8,000 of that 15,000, 16,000. Well, what does that mean for the public schools? They get to keep the local and the federal funding. So on a per pupil basis, they actually end up with higher revenues and expenditures per student. Just imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart for whatever reason, and you started shopping at Trader Joe's for whatever reason, and Walmart got to keep half of your grocery bill and funding in perpetuity. That would be a good deal for Walmart. It wouldn't make a lot of sense, but I would argue it's similarly a good deal for the public schools, that they get to keep tons of the funding, thousands of dollars each year for students they're no longer educating.
That is really a fascinating principle. When you kind of dig into it and you apply logic to the system, it's really quite amazing what you can do. One of the things, we've talked about incentives over and over and over again. And my contention is that the groups that are driving the public education system or the government monopoly right now are teachers' unions, state legislatures, the federal Department of Education, and local school boards. So you basically have 4 groups that are making decisions. But what I have failed to see is if any of these organizations or groups have incentives to put the child first. Is the research shows that their incentive structure, it's not what they say they want, but their actual incentives show that, putting children first is really not in their best interest.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. If you think about the incentive structure at play with all these groups, they currently have a monopoly. They get your money no matter what. And so, of course, they're going to fight against any change to the status quo. And we see that play out every single time a school choice bill is introduced that would try to empower parents. You see the normal groups, the teachers unions, the superintendents unions, the school boards associations, all fighting to keep your kids' education dollars in their institutions. The problem is they get this idea of property completely backwards. They think that your kids' education dollars belong to them. But the reality is the money's meant for your child. And once you can point that out, it's really hard for them to argue with this. That's why I've tried to change the conversation to saying that instead of school choice, we should fund students, not systems. If you want to argue with that, they're all of a sudden on defense trying to argue why we should fund the system and not the student. And if we center all of the conversations on the student, it becomes very obvious that they are more concerned about protecting their institutions instead of doing what's best for the kid. Because otherwise, they would just let the kid choose and the families choose, and they'd be confident in their product that they would do if they were doing a great job for the families. So we see that happen everywhere. And as far as one piece of research I wanted to point out is that, the claim is that their institutions are going to crumble because they have to change their game. But the reality is the public schools do a good job when there is competition. School choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. So there have been 27 studies on this topic. 25 of 27 studies, the vast majority of the studies, find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the outcomes in the public school system. So this doesn't destroy public schools, it makes them better. I have confidence that the public schools will up their game in response to competition. And if you care about any data at all, the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence, 25 of 27 studies, finds that theory it has merit, that competition leads to better outcomes in every industry, including K12 education.
That's fascinating. Now, one of the things is the mechanics of this. Sometimes people have talked about vouchers, but something that's happening right now across the nation is states are passing these ESAs. Could you talk about that just real quick and bring us up to speed? What is an ESA and how is it different than maybe a voucher?
Yeah, so for listeners, the idea of the voucher should be something you're kind of familiar with, but if not, the basic idea is that the money that would have followed your child to their residentially assigned government-run school, you can still take it there if you want. If you like your public school, you can keep your public school, but if not, for whatever reason, half of that funding, typically the state portion of the funding, would follow the child in the form of the voucher, where you could take it to a private school to pay for tuition and fees. Pretty basic. The funding follows the decision of the individual family, whether that's the government-run school, or if not, you can opt out and take that funding in the form of a voucher to a private school. The education savings account method is pretty similar, but it's literally that funding that would have went to the government school. Again, you can still choose that with the ESA. The funding would, instead of being in the form of a voucher, you could put it into an education savings account that is directed by the family for the child. You could still say, I'm going to take that funding and spend it on private school tuition and fees like a voucher, but you could also take the funding to any other approved education provider. You could use it for a micro school, a pandemic pod, which is essentially a setup where 5 to 10 children get together in a household to economize on the process of homeschooling. We saw a lot of these sprout up starting in March of 2020. You could use the funding for home-based education curriculum or other instructional materials. You can use the funding for private tutoring. So it's like a voucher in that you can use it for private school tuition and fees, but it's more than a voucher in that you can use it for any approved education expenditure. It doesn't have to be a brick and mortar private school, but you still have that option with the education savings account.
How many states have been enacting these?
Yeah, so the bills that I've seen flying around state legislatures recently in particular have been more education savings account focused as opposed to voucher focused. I think from what I've last seen this year in 2022, about 34 states had bills at least introduced this year to fund students as opposed to systems. And the vast majority of those states had education savings accounts that were proposed. And the number of states that have these types of programs actually doubled in 2021. We're calling 2021 the year of school choice on a national level, at least, because of such huge momentum in the number of, in one, the support for school choice, according to polling, and then also the legislative victories in 2021 were phenomenal, mostly because the teachers unions overplayed their hand. I mean, they were pushing to keep the schools closed. Families started to wake up with remote learning, seeing what the heck was going on in the classroom, started to see that there was another dimension of school quality that they weren't as familiar with, which is more, schools are just way more than just standardized tests, math and reading scores. They're also about values and families wanting their kids to be raised in a certain way. So that also helped elevate the case for school choice. And again, in 2021, the number of states that expanded or enacted school choice policies was about 19 states. So huge victories. And the number of states with these education savings account programs doubled from 5 states to 10 states. And Michigan also passed an education savings account program, but it was vetoed by their governor. So it would have been 11 states. But the good news in Michigan is that you can override a governor's veto just by getting a few 100,000 signatures. It doesn't even have to go to the ballot. You just do a signature gathering initiative. So I'm optimistic that Michigan will be the 11th state with an education savings account program once they finish gathering signatures. And Idaho had a push this year in 2022 as well. There was a minor victory with kind of these
innovative classrooms,
micro grants, essentially.
Micro grants,
yeah. But the education savings account proposal, the better proposal, actually did not make it out of the committee. But there's going to be a renewed push.
It's gaining steam. Yeah. Now, is there in this movement? You're talking about a lot of momentum, and it's really good for kids. It's great for engaging parents, and it's good for people who are in the monopoly of education right now. It's good for teachers. It's really good for them. What kind of books or materials would you encourage my audience to investigate or look, or steps that they could take if they want to find out more, how they could be involved, or resources that might benefit them in this process?
Yeah, so I obviously want to point out that you should check out my co-edited volume at the Cato Institute with Neil McCluskey. It's called School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. You can find it at Amazon. You can find it at the Cato Institute website. Again, School Choice Myths. And then also, if you want to help me in the fight to push for educational freedom all across the country, in Idaho and elsewhere, you can go to the Education Freedom Pledge. And you can find that at educationfreedompledge.com, or for short, you can just type in edfreedompledge.com, and you can sign up whenever a bill is moving through your legislature in whatever state that you're in. We'll notify you about it, and you could help us push for these initiatives in your state.
Well, thank you, Corey, for being here today. It's good that we could get in a forum where we have about a half hour because you get to go a little bit deeper. You get a little bit more detail, and I love the research basis of what you're doing. You're saying these are studies. This is research. This is data that we're pulling in, because what we at Upstream want to do is partner with organizations like yours and what you're doing, that says basically that what we can do is we can find data, we can find research, scientific studies that say this is what is best for children. Why aren't we doing this? So I want to say thank you for your research. Thank you for spearheading this movement. And our hope is that it will continue to grow and that your efforts will bring about tremendous momentum and change for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.